first thing I wanted to kind of say is that, you know, as always, anytime that we learn anything, we have to integrate that knowledge over time. Because to be honest, if you're anything like me, the first time you hear something, it kind of washes over you, and you need time and time again to hear it and then to kind of make sense of it, to find out what areas, you know, I love this. I have many, many teachers in my life, both people who I know myself and those who have come through their knowledge from other resources, from books and online and elsewhere. And there's a wonderful teacher from Latin America called Paulo Freire. And if you get the chance, try and find, I'll get Tamani to maybe put Paulo's name in the chat a little clearer, because this slide is not very clear. But Paulo Freire really talks a lot about education for freedom, education for liberation, and that all knowledge should be able to be shared in a way that is a process, so that we can get information. Information is not the same as knowledge, right? So it's presented to us and then we co-shape it. We do that shaping together. We wrestle with it, we negotiate with what it means. We go, do I believe in that? Do I not? What do others say about it? Are there more definitions that, you know, that could be useful? And then you discuss it, you reflect on it, and then you kind of come to an understanding. And to be honest, it's a lifelong process, right? And for movements, it's a process beyond the lifetime, because whatever we've managed to gather today is coming from the works, you know, the work of those who come before us. So I think it's really important to first talk about that learning is not just knowing it and you know it today, and now I'm an expert on Sojisek, because you can actually do a lot of damage as well when you do that, when you act like your knowledge is the only set of knowledge that's useful. Okay. So let's backtrack just for about 10, 15 minutes. I really want to make sure that we're integrating who we are and what we're doing in this room. So most of us, I think all of us that are in the Zoom room are from somewhere in the 22 Pacific Island states and territories. I don't know if you know, but the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Meeting, the 51st meeting, is on in Suva right at the moment. And we have these countries. And one of the things that maybe we should just quickly, you know, note while we're here is there's a few countries who aren't in the room because there's been some conflicts, some what you call geopolitical conflicts in the region. So Kiribati didn't turn up this week, but I think Cook Islands and a few others also aren't in the room. And one of the things about that is that all of these ideas about who we are as individual people, who we are as collectives of people, as society, as nation states, they're all what we call contingent. They can be contested. You can pull them apart and you can say, I feel like a real part of this community, or I reject that label. This is a label that I really don't feel like it's really me. So there's all these ideas about who we are as human beings, as individuals, and who we are as collectives and societies and people. And I hold that, please, in your head and your heart as we go through this discussion today, because it's important to think about that. If we're very, very clear on who we are and this is who I am, sometimes you miss from being able to open up to some new language. As our friends at CREA, one of the great groups from India in our movement, says, suspend judgment. Always try and hold judgment so that you can learn more and contest things. So we're from Pacific small island states, but as we say, we're all also Pacific large ocean states. Okay. Then the next thing to talk about is what is feminism, right? And we know that we've talked about this before, about what is feminism and what is it not. So feminists believe that there's a structural system called patriarchy, that it leads some people to have more power than others, that there is what we call a pyramid kind of number of people who have a lot of power with a very smaller amount of people at the top. And then we come down through society, and there's a lot of people who really don't feel like they can be everything that they need to be in their lives, that they can negotiate for power like they wish, for freedom and for liberation. So feminists say that we recognize this system, but the next thing that we do is we say, we recognize it, but feminist praxis means you have to try and do something about it. So feminist works, if you look at the last paragraph here, feminism works to break down those unjust practices and systems and to try and see how we build new and just systems on all territories. And remember, for all of us, that means including the body as well. Okay, the body, but it's also the air, the water with other species, the planet, the whole system from the smallest to the largest, right? Okay. And one of the things that we've said from the past is every time you kind of take away an old frame, it can be painful because you have to then question, oh, what about all those things that I believed? And there's people around you who are saying, I don't know why you suddenly changed. I don't know why you believe in this big thing like gender justice now. Where did that come from? You know who's the head of our households. You know who's the head of our religious practices. So all of these things are very difficult because when you start to change, you then see the world in another way and you have to keep moving that knowledge. Okay. So sometimes people say, okay, whatever, Noelene, what does it look like then? If you say that you work in a place and you live in a community and you try and have a household that is feminist, what does it try to be? So what it tries to be is to try and use action and reflection, to try and deal with power openly, you know, to negotiate. It tries to work both on what are the changes that we need every day to our lives, but also the structure, the underlying frameworks. It says, don't talk about us, but do the work with us. So nothing about us without us. We really try to not do further harm as we do this work, because you can, right? You can mess around in a pot and then all of a sudden the recipe changes. So what happens? How do you negotiate that when people's lives are turned around? Because all of a sudden, for instance, let's say you're in a violent marriage and all of a sudden you're changing the way that you are in that relationship, that you are in that home. And then things shift everywhere. So how is that negotiated and whose responsibility is it? And what kind of care is needed in order to shift those conditions, right? Because it doesn't just change overnight because all of a sudden you've decided, no more, I'm done with this, okay? So we just want to say that Diva's been around for 10 years now. Part of what we've been trying to do is to say, that we've been doing this for 10 years and we tried to build from the inside outwards. So when you see this work, this is over 10 years of work, but to be honest, it's another 35 years back from that as well. It's another 100 years back in some of the work that's been done by feminists all around the world, both in the economic north and in the economic south, right? And what it means is all of these things, which is we are crucially interested in how do we make sure that we look at poverty and pro-poor analysis and work? How do we prioritize those parts of society and the state that are underserved? How practically can we do that? And what is the difference between living, say, in a high density setting in an urban area as opposed to a rural village, as opposed to maybe a village in Gamea? Viva and Kado and others are going to Gamea next week and to Kandavu in a couple of months. What is different in those places? And what do we have to adjust in ourselves? And that they have to adjust as they work with us as well. How do those relationships work? And are we used to looking at power and control? Everything that Diva does is about working on power and control, including this work today on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression and sex characteristics. You're going to hear me say that long phrase over and over and over again. So it's just like any language learning, right? It's fine. Over time, it becomes easier to hear it. And then you get used to the acronym, SOGISEC or SOGISC, and you go, oh, okay, I know what she's talking about. It's the same when we're talking about violence. When we're talking about violence and power and control, we sometimes use the term SGBV, or sexual and gender-based violence, and sometimes to make sure that we're talking specifically about the gender-based violence that targets women, we talk about EVOR, elimination of violence against women and girls. And I always end with and gender non-binary people, because we can talk about violence against women, violence against men, but we also have to talk about violence against those bodies that are gender non-binary, that sit on the spectrum. Okay. What we also have to do is we have to make sure we're working on climate and global warming. Of course, anything you do has to be about economics. It has to be about development. It has to be about tackling those systems that nobody wants to talk about, right? If we are not willing to look at how we are in the Pacific and how much power and control, for instance, that Australia and New Zealand have, we're never going to make it anywhere. Yep, those leaders are meeting and they need to be clear that we expect them to work on the social, the economic, the ecological, and the climate. And we've talked about all of these things before. I'm more doing this both to keep putting forward the knowledge, but also because there's some new people in the room today, because this is about SOGISEC. So we want to be sure that they're grounded as well. Let's not pretend we're only talking about sexual orientation, gender identity and expression and sex characteristics. We're also talking about corporations that are killing our planet and the ways that we have society that puts certain people down and raises other people. All of these things matter to us when we're talking about SOGISEC. All of these things matter also because climate change is now so urgent. We don't have decades to work on this. Even the governments now, they're so slow, right, to recognize these things. Even they are starting to say, oh my goodness, it's a climate emergency. This week, apparently, they're going to declare the Pacific in a state of climate emergency. Why it wasn't done before, we don't know, but at least finally, it looks like they'll be able to declare it, yeah? So good, that's a good thing, because the systems are under massive attack. Of the 9 planetary boundaries, we have violated 5 of those boundaries. So we only have 4 that are left intact. And we have to think about those things. Climate change is just a symptom. It's like when you have a really bad infection in your body and you get coughing and a cold like I've got right now. It's not about the coughing and the cold. It's about the system has some things in it that we need to heal. Yeah. Same with the planet. And the reason why we do it is we measure all the wrong things. So we've already talked about this in the past, but if we don't start to measure that blue and that green about the things that the earth does for us, about the things that the care economy does for us, the love economy, then we will never change what's happening in the world. I put on in this slide all the time because movement matters, and it matters both inside civil society, but also what's happening within the development institutions and also what's happening within the governments. And we've got to be able to make sure that we can talk about these issues. We might be already moving the work on SOGISEC, for instance, on sexual and reproductive health and rights, but the governments don't even want to look at it. They're just like, oh, no, too much. What are those women talking about again? What are those LGBTQI people talking about? So all of those sets of work need to be moving at around the same pace. There will always be those of us who are out in front. There will always be those of us who are working in the middle, and there will always be those who go very, very slow. But we've got to be clear on which people those are so that we are always advancing, right? If you look at this, you can see, finally, can you imagine? This is the 51st meeting of Pacific Island leaders, and it's the first ever meeting of Pacific women leaders. A forum was held just before, a couple of months ago. Unbelievable to me that it's taken 51 years for this to happen, but that's the truth of it. And so now we have to say, okay, so what next though? Once we've got the forum of Pacific Island women leaders in place, who's not in the room? For instance, they had no civil society women leaders in the room. Why? That's something that we have already talked about with them, and they are working to help remedy that for next year and future years. It's also about which women are in leadership. Is it local government also that are able to access some of these sites? Maybe we'll need other forums that feed into that main forum at a regional level. Maybe we have to work out how that regional forum is supported and working with the global. So it's always about taking where we've got to one step at a time and going, but we're thinking 5, 7, 10 steps ahead. Yeah, because we can't wait. And so we need better tools. We need to think about all of these issues, which we've already talked about in the past. We need better methods. We have to make sure that our methods are good for wherever our work is, and that every time that we're able to integrate more knowledge, that it shows up in the work that we do. If not, we're going to have all the same old tools, and we're trying to do these great new ideas. We're saying to people, please, you have to work with us on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. Governments, you have to do this work with us. And yet we're not even sure how to design maybe data tools that collect that information. We don't know how to do that in a just way. We don't know how to do analysis within the civil service. We don't know how to do that work on the ground with communities. So what's the point of having a great idea if you don't know how to put that into action? So part of our work is always that praxis. So we've got to work better action. And the third one is really important. And I spent a little bit of time working on this because people often can say what's wrong, but it's hard to move towards something that's better, right? That might be more right. I'm not saying we get it perfect, but it's a bit better than what we have. And one of these things is, what if this was a world that we could look forward to, right? What if it was like this? In beloved community, all individuals, so both the individual, not just the collective matters, not just the individual matters, but both, all individuals and collectives of both people, humans, and species, other species, justly share the earth. What if that was the first proposal? What about poverty, inequity, hunger, and homelessness won't be tolerated, right? Imagine a world where we say absolutely not, and we'll make sure it's not. And that free, prior, and informed consent, we're going to talk about consent later again. The idea that you have a role in being able to say what our present and our future is, that indigenous and international standards won't allow that. Racism and all forms of discrimination, whether they're bigotry or prejudice, whatever it is, based on anything, is replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of degrowth. So, you know, we have this idea in society that everything can keep growing, 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 growing. And that's why we keep trying to take more from the earth, from the air, from the water, from the ocean. So what if instead we were looking for balance, for degrowth and balance? And the second idea is, what if we were working for social provisioning, what feminists have called social provisioning, trying to have all those things in place in educational, in health, in well-being, in housing, in shelter, in water and sanitation, in food sovereignty, so that if you are a person, there is a framework of social provisioning around you to help you from the time you're born to the time you pass off this planet, you die. One of the things that stops a lot of work on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics is this idea that you either are so Western that all you care about is your individual rights, right? So you such a Western thing that's got nothing to do with us, we're collective. And then the other side is we're all so collective, we're so indigenous, we're so together that the rights of the individual don't matter. And to be honest, it's a false question, because the requirement is both, right? And the idea of this is that you are both the drop in the ocean and you are the part of the entire ocean. So both matter, that you have to look at the individual and consent, and you have to look at the collectives and consent, whether it's a collective in a house, whether it's a collective in an institution, whether it's a collective in a society, or a country or a region or a globe, right? You are part of both, the one and the many. And it seems like a common sense thing to say, but it actually is the kind of throwaway lines. Humans can be very lazy. You know, we go, oh no, this human rights, nothing to do with me because I'm so collective. Or, oh, this has nothing to do with me because, you know, I don't want to talk about collective issues because I'm an individual and only what I think matters. So it is both. And then the next slide is that what it's really asking us to do, as we've said before, when we did the work on ecological justice, is it's asking humans to decenter ourselves, to stop trying to always put our needs at the top of the pyramid, because it's a false pyramid. We are really in an ecosystem, in an ecosphere, and we are with many, including each other and including other species on the planet. But even now, we are going beyond that. If you look at some of the work now that's being done on ecocide, what it's saying is that whole, the rights of nature, is about looking at the system and saying, come on, all of you who are starting to affect the system as a whole, and look, it's not even just starting, all of you who have severely affected the ecosphere, you've got to stop it, because you're not just affecting single ones here, there, and everywhere, the entire system as we know it. What we call the Holocene is now the Anthropocene. We have changed so much about our planet that it's in a few decades, it will be unrecognizable as the planet on which we have all been able to call home. So we've got to think about those shifts, to ecological thinking. Okay, so what are we, you know, I tried to give you summary slides, because then when you go off and you do your own work, you can sit and think through some of these issues. So one of the things to think about is, what really are we struggling against? Well, one of the things that we're struggling against is called heteropatriarchy. The idea that patriarchy has to sit on men here and women here, and it's a binary. So there's no space to think outside that it's just men on top, women below. So that's called heterobinaries, right? So heteropatriarchy, imperialism is about countries that think that they have the right because of, you know, have you heard of the phrase, might is right? It means if I'm bigger than you, basically at a very basic level, if I'm bigger than you, then I'm allowed to bully you. Basically, that's what imperialism is. It's the basis for colonialism. So it's like saying, I don't have enough in my place. Oh, look, you have the resources in your place. I'm going to come there, and because I have the power and the technology, I can come there and take the resources from you. Nothing about the fact that you have your own sovereignty and you should be able to have your own resources, but it's about, I have might is right on my side. I'm bigger and I'm stronger than you. So there's many things like right-wing, what we call right-wing religiosity. If you have your own religious and your faith beliefs and they are personal, then that's a wonderful thing, right? Whether you are a person who does or does not believe in a higher power, a god, a goddess, that's your personal belief. But once it starts to take over and become systemic, and everyone is expected to follow, as we all know becomes the case in many, many nation states, then it becomes really difficult. Why have all the women of the United States of America just lost their ability to make up their minds about their own bodies with the right to abortion being taken out by their Supreme Court? Because they forgot about this. They allowed for the non-separation, the bringing together of church and state. If you keep it separate, then it means that the nation state is supposed to serve everyone. There are problems always with the nation state, right? But if you have religion placed on it and the two come together and no one's guarding that separation, then you start to see these unjust laws put into place where you are able to tell people what they should and should not do with their bodies. And as Gloria Steinman says, the right of the state stops at the body. It stops at the human body. So when the state starts to think that it can tell us what we do about abortion and about who we marry and about who we love, then they have crossed our bodily integrity. They have crossed the line, and we will talk about that later. So all of these things matter, because what starts to happen over hundreds, thousands of years is these things start to set into place, right? And everybody thinks, oh, it can't be changed. But it can be changed. Power only moves, though, if you push it, if you have the will to change it, right? So that's why we call it social movements, to push. It is the power for collective change, that enough people say, this is unjust, we will move it. That's why women got the right to vote. We wouldn't have got it unless women around the world said, stop. Why is it that you think only you have the right to vote? Push, social movements push. Over 100 years ago now, the first votes for women came out of New Zealand, very close to home. Now, it would be unthinkable, except in a couple of places, for women not to have the electoral right to vote. So we keep pushing. But does that mean justice? Of course it doesn't. That's only one thing. It's about the vote. What about everything else that is about equality and justice and liberation for all? Set? So that's I've tried to put all of this together in one slide as well, so you can talk about it in your organization and think about, is that easy? Because how do we, next slide, how do we counter heteropatriarchy? How do we counter racism? How do we stop coloniality and imperial powers? Very, very difficult, right? So we have to be brave, and we have to give some proposals. We have to be deliberate, because if all we say is, oh, I hate this, then that's not saying anything. All that's saying is, I can raise my hand and shout into the wind. That's great, but it's not enough, because you have to be deliberate, you have to work to build power, and we have to find ways to be dangerous together. What does that mean? That means dangerous in the best sense of the word. That we don't just walk into a room and we're timid because there's a whole lot of men in there and we go, okay, I'm just going to go along with it. It's too hard. Every time I look at a photo of Pacific leaders, I see too many men and too few women. But instead of saying, oh, okay, well, that's obviously the way the world is, we can have another reaction. We can say, aha, even more motivated to be deliberate and powerful and dangerous and to change that photo. And every time we get more in that photo, it helps. And every time we get more women in parliament, it helps. And every time we get more people who are working like you and I in social movements, it helps to move together, to change the power together. Yep. Next slide. So what we are doing is we are endlessly practicing. I was just on a lovely session the other day and we talked a lot about experimentation. We have to be brave and to experiment. You know, as children, we call it play. Yeah? We're so good at experimenting, trialing things. As we get older, we become more cautious. We're like, oh no, but this will happen if I do that and this will happen. So some of that is good sense, but some of it too becomes just too easy to say no. Just too many things that I might lose. Yeah. If I do this, then someone might not like me. If I speak about sexual orientation, someone in my family might come and say something about me. If I work on it in my community, what if they stop me coming to church? There are many, many consequences. So we're trying to negotiate that power all the time. Remember this slide from when we talked about social movements? The reason why we talked about this in terms of organizing is to say some of us have to take up a role in different areas, right? So some of us are about knowledge building. We're really good at knowledge building. We're really good at educating for liberation. So do that and do that well. Some of us are better at doing conscientization work. What does that mean? It means we're really good at the stuff that is saying, come work with me as a group and together we'll explore these really difficult questions. and we will work out how we change ourselves and others' lives. That's conscientization, to make sense of something and then to turn it into a struggle for justice. Conscientization. What is my place in this struggle? How will I work with others? How do I make it real in my life? And then the third one is, I might be better at mobilization. I'm one of those people who can get people into a room, and I can help us to do that work together, and off we move. Now suddenly there's 30, 50, 100, 1,000 of us. So some people are better on mobilization. Organizing is another step on from mobilization. And I always try and say this to people, because if you only stop at mobilization, I will build numbers, then that's not really doing the work of change. Because in order for 1,000 people to work together on something, you have to organize. You have to work out, how are we going to deal with issues of leadership, of conflict, of prioritization, which matters more than others? What are the steps we take? What are the small tactics and the long-term strategy? If you can't do that work of organizing over time, then you'll just get stuck in, I'll just do a fantastic campaign with lots of branding, and we're going to do all these beautiful sets of work, but nothing can change because you can't build your powerful organizing over time. So some of us need to do that organizing work. And then we have to be clear about the difference between activism and advocacy. Activism, to me, the difference between these two is activism, I'm pushing the rock up the hill. Advocacy, I'm helping others and advocating for those who push the rock up the hill. If you only sit on this side and you are the one who's saying, yes, let's do this, we must do it, and we must do it like this, and you're not actually doing any activism yourself, then really over time you start to lose the relationships with your constituency, the people with whom you say you work, all of you, whoever it is that's in our constituencies. So activism and advocacy is very different things, but we conflate it, and we do that for many, many reasons. We're going to talk about that in our November and December sets of work. That's the last set of work. But above and below ground activism is about saying not everything is about going rah, rah, rah in the public. Sometimes the work, for instance, in sexuality rights, some of that work is about laying groundwork for change, is about doing, for instance, Diva does a lot of work in the universities, and we do a lot of work with the police, and we do 3-hour sessions like this one. We might not go in the middle of the newspaper and say, this is what we're doing. Why? Because you can get people upset sometimes, and they won't even let you into the room. So you got to put your ego aside and not worry about whether the public knows or not. You got to do the work. When it's public work, then you communicate with the public on the issue. So it becomes not ego-centric, but work-centric to get the outcomes out of the work you do. Okay, so the last thing I'd say is, you know why I put all those arrows in? And this is the same for SOGISEC and Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights work. Some of us will always be there at the front pushing. Some always need to come in the middle and the back line. We need to connect sometimes. If you find it very, very difficult to work with others, be clear at least why that is. If there's certain sets of group and you're like, man, I really don't see how they're helping us in our long-term movement struggle, be willing to say that. Be willing, but be clear on why you're saying it. Because if you don't know why, but you're just like, oh, can't stand those people, then that is just about ego. That is not about political positioning. But also, if you say that you are in the front line, be clear why you're saying that. Are you really in the front line? Are there sets of work that you are taking forward? Are you just saying that you are, but really you're actually in the back line? You're not really moving much at all. It's a lot of white noise. So think about where you are in the social movements and think about how we have good, healthy, assertive relationships with each other. And to be honest, that has to mean conflict transformation. On the area of sexual rights, it is the most important set of work, because you are always going to get people who go, that's against my religion, I don't even want to talk to you about that. Yes, I'm a human rights defender, but I still don't want to talk about that. So you've got to be willing to do that work of change. Oh, why do you feel like that? Okay, how do we bring that into another space? Do you think maybe that we can do that work with you? Would you like to do some work on Sojisek? If all you're saying is you're a terrible person, then you're not going to get very far in that set of work. That is about mobilizing, organizing, and movement building for change over time.